Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Julie from the Chartered Banker Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our Coaching for Success webinar with Marie Taylor, who has 18 years experience as an executive coach and developer of leaders. Some of our members may already be familiar with Marie's work from the Nelson Coombe Managing Your Professional Career online course, which can be found under e-learning in the My CPD Hub. She's also the author of 4 books, including Business Coaching and Mentoring for Dummies. Without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Marie, who will talk us through how we can improve employee satisfaction, employee loyalty, team morale, and our bottom lines with the right approach to business coaching. If you have any questions for Marie throughout this session, please use the online function, and she will aim to answer as many as she can prior to close today. Over to you, Marie.
Thanks very much, Julie. Good afternoon, good morning or good evening, everyone, depending upon what part of the world you're dialing in from. It's my pleasure to be with you today for this next hour, around about 55 minutes or so, to give you a flavour of the question that we're here to answer, which is about thinking through how can we coach purposefully to create success, to improve employee satisfaction, loyalty, morale and bottom line. So the slide you have in front of you tells you a little bit about me. You can see there that the book that Julie's already mentioned is out. There are 15 videos that accompany the book if you're somebody who prefers visual learning. And there are also 15 podcasts for those of you who prefer to listen to information. Podcasts are very short, as are the videos, about 8 minutes maximum. And of course, the best source of information, if you're interested, is in the book, which is available from lots of bookstores and on, of course, Amazon. You can also see on that page how you can follow me on Twitter or link in with me on LinkedIn, and also see the headline there for the blog. Julie mentioned that I've been coaching for 18 years. I've been in leadership development for around 25. My business works internationally, and we work to look at supporting leaders how to coach, how to handle change management issues, issues around personal resilience and well-being, mentoring, career management, and lots of other organisational development type consultancy projects. In terms of myself, I'm a fellow of the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. I have an MBA from Cambridge University, where I'm also an invited fellow at the University Business School there in Cambridge. And I did my postgraduate diploma in coaching and consulting 20 years ago. So that's my kind of background, and the business has been around for 14 years. So that gives you a little flavour. So let's move on and think about what is our focus for today. So what I'd like to do with you today is just share some insights on how purposeful coaching can help you and how it can help you. Sorry, excuse me a second. Sorry, don't know what's happening here. Sorry. Our focus is to consider how to become a leader who coaches and how it can also develop you too. So thinking about really how do you work with your people to enable them to become more satisfied at work, more engaged and improve their morale. And why do I say that it's important to do this? Well, simply, coaching, I think, is important because it helps you and your team get really clear and really effective at defining what and how to deliver business outcomes. So if you think about the role of a leader, primarily leaders are about developing the vision, communicating the vision, being able to think about what do we need to do to deliver outcomes in the organisation. But then sometimes as leaders, we get a little bit too involved in the how of doing that, and we become quite telling people how to do it. Whereas in coaching, what we're trying to do is enable people to define their own how. So if you think of it in those simple terms, leaders are there to help us to think about the why of doing something, to explain why we're doing something, and the what, what needs to be delivered in terms of outcome. But in coaching, we're helping people to understand that, but to generate their own ways of doing it, to generate the ways in which they might deliver that result. And in essence, the premise really in coaching is if we can enable people to do that, they're more likely to be motivated by it, they're more likely to take ownership of it, and in fact more likely to then follow through and do it in order to achieve bottom line results. So if you think about coaching in that context for the rest of the time that we're together, that will really help you. So let me just go through very briefly, and hopefully nothing will turn itself on. In the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to look at really these 4 areas. What is coaching? What are the key conditions that you might want to create to maximise success in your team and within yourself? We're going to look at a framework for creating purposeful conversations, and we're going to look at some ideas on where you can use coaching, and in particular 3 types of conversation that I'm going to suggest you might have to create success for yourself and others. So in terms of those 4 areas, we're going to do the first 2 quite quickly and then spend a bit more time on the frameworks that I'm going to share with you. The frameworks are obviously in the slide pack, but they're also in the book and explained in a lot more detail in Business Coaching and Mentoring for Dummies. So let's think about, why is coaching important? So you notice here that I'm saying coaching with a focus on performance, because that's the kind of space where leaders should be hanging out. So we should be focusing on performance in terms of performance improvement or sustaining performance within our teams. So these are 2 reasons why I propose that it's important. So we're really trying to enhance organisational performance as leaders. That's basically the biggest job of leadership, to try and support people to take responsibility for outcome delivery. And that's what coaching can really help you with. It's a great way of enabling others to take responsibility, even if you retain accountability for the outcome. So even if you're accountable as the leader for the delivery of your team, helping people to think about, okay, what am I responsible for in delivering that? Coaching is a great way of doing that, because it enables you to have the dialogue that sets that out and makes that very, very clear. Secondly, what we're trying to do is to engage colleagues and sometimes other stakeholders. It isn't always just about our staff and our peer group, but we're trying to help to engage people around a set of shared values and a common vision. And when we think about coaching, if we're clear about that, it provides a way for us to encourage engagement and accountability with that vision and with those values by engaging people in, so how do we do that? You know, how do we employ our vision? How do we make that a reality? What are our values as an organisation? And in relation to my team or in relation to you as an individual, how might you make those manifest? What do you do in your role or as a team to enable those values to be articulated well? What does it look like in your team? Coaching helps us to ask some of those questions and to have some of those types of conversations. So let's move on to think a little bit about, what do we mean by coaching? But before we do that, I want to just ask you our first polling question, which Julie's going to pop up in a moment. So I want you to think about this question, and remember this is an anonymous poll, so we'll just get the percentage results at the end of it. No one will see what you're polling. I want to just get a sense of how many of you at the moment coach your people and are absolutely confident that you delegate as much as you possibly can and help your people to grow. And how many of you know that you could be better at letting go of the reins? If you just take the polling question, do you coach your colleagues and staff to create high performance? Or are you a leader who manages and controls too much in the pursuit of success? So we'll leave that open for 30 seconds. So keep voting. So do you coach your colleagues to create high performance? Or are you a leader who manages and controls too much in the pursuit of success? Okay. So 73% of you answered A. Do you coach your colleagues to create and staff to create high performance? And 27% of you say that you're a leader who manages and controls too much in the pursuit of success. That's kind of the average. So we would normally have about 70% of people answering the first question as you have, and about 30% answering the second. My question for you to think about, not necessarily now, is if I went and asked your team, asked the people that you lead and manage, what would they say? That's not a polling question. It's just something to think about. Because in our experience, if we ask people that question in organisations, the figures are almost reversed. So people sometimes believe that they could be coached more, that they could be supported more to deliver to those outcomes. So that's great. So let's move on. Thank you for that. Let's move on to think about what do we mean by coaching? How do we define it? So I just want to give you this definition to read through. This is a definition that we've adapted. We use it a lot from the Association for Coaching, who accredit one of our programs. So we run a Leaders Coach program. It's accredited by the Association for Coaching. So we like to use this adapted definition. Just have a read of that. Okay, so what I'd like you to notice about that definition is that it proposes that coaching is solution focused. So it has an emphasis on solving problems. It's results orientated, so it's not some kind of random conversation that we're having. It has a defined outcome and defined results orientation. It's systematic in its nature. It's helping us facilitate work performance, to enhance work performance, helping us to think about the personal growth of the employee, the coachee. And all of that we're doing in order to improve business performance or sustain business performance, I would argue sometimes. So if you look at that definition, there's a lot going on in the coaching conversation. So it's a structured process, it's a structured conversation, and it's much more about looking at the outcome focus and focus on solution. So these are three things really that I would define coaching as. It's a collaboration. So it's solution focused in its nature and it's collaborative. So I sometimes describe this as we're not having a coaching conversation if it feels like you're playing mental ping pong. So sometimes when we're managers who tell rather than coach, we might ask a question, but we're just waiting for the response. We're not really engaged in the conversation. It's very transactional, and it's normally focused around activity. Did you do this? Yes, I did. Have you done that? Yes, I have. So it's much more kind of question-answer type dialogue in a tell conversation. In a coaching conversation, it's two-way and it's collaborative. We're trying to solve a problem together, with the emphasis being on being very clear about who in that collaboration is going to have to take the action. And that, of course, is a member of staff or the coachee, whichever you prefer to call the person. Think about it as a conversation of self-discovery. So it's a conversation. It's not an accountability check-in type activity. It's a conversation where we're trying to help people to look at themselves and think about what have they done well, to think about actually what are you learning about yourself and the organisation, what you're learning about your customers, what you're learning about what you're doing. So there's an element in there where we want to help people with their learning, to help them to get the odd aha moment. And the reason we're doing that is because it will motivate them more. It will also help them to think about, actually, what am I achieving and delivering in the organisation that this organisation values? So think of it as a conversation of self-discovery. There's development and growth in this conversation. And thirdly, it's a sharing of power to support growth and development. So we use this word empower quite loosely. And if I went and spoke to a group of managers, most of them would say, yes, I really empower my people. I believe in empowerment. And we do. But when we empower someone, that involves us giving up a degree of our power. We have to give something up as leaders when we're power sharing and empowering other people. So we're motivating people to deliver results, and when we're engaging them, one of the best ways of engaging people is to think about, actually, what am I holding on to as a manager that I don't need to? How can I empower the people that I lead and manage even more in order to support their growth and development? It's useful sometimes to also ask ourselves as managers, when we're thinking about coaching, how much is of the conversation I'm having with individuals is actually about supporting their growth and development? You know, do you have coaching conversations where you help people to think about what they're learning and how they're going to apply it in their everyday work? Or do you just let people go off on training or doing their own courses of study and rarely talk to them about what's the application of that back in the workplace? Even asking people the questions sometimes, what have you learnt this month, can be a really helpful coaching question. So those are kind of three areas that define for me what coaching is if we boiled it down into its component parts. What I've just said earlier is we're really in leadership focusing on performance coaching. So we're not focusing on life coaching or transformational coaching that executive coaches might do. We're focusing on how do I help this person to sustain and improve their performance. And normally what that means is we're helping people to change the way they behave, improve or sustain their ability or to enhance their self-belief. So very often if we look at boiling down what actually happens in coaching, what are the three key areas that leaders and individuals coach around, and actually very often also executive coaches coach around, it can be boiled down into these three areas: gaining clarity, being motivated, and increasing confidence. So what I'd like you to do is the second polling question, so if Julie could pop up the second polling question, I want you to think about what is the top reason that people want coaching in organisations. So there's three options there: gaining clarity, to be more motivated, to increase your confidence about what they're doing. So if you can just take a look at that second voting question and just vote for one. So what do you think is the top reason that people want coaching in organisations? What do they come for? So keep voting, you've got a few more seconds left. Okay, so let's take a look at those percentage results. Oh, that's interesting. So we've got A, to gain clarity. 17% of you think that most coaching conversations are about gaining clarity. 10% of you think it's about being more motivated. And 72% of you think it's about increasing confidence about what they're doing. Absolutely spot on. So in terms of why people come for coaching, most people it comes in all sorts of guises, but essentially it's to help people to increase their confidence about what they're doing. So invariably people may say, I'm coming for coaching because I need help with, for example, my presentation skills, or I need help with managing a particular member of my team. But in fact, what they're coming to coaching for is to increase their confidence. They know what to do. Most of the time, after a short coaching conversation, they know how to do it. What they need help with is the confidence aspects, so the confidence aspects of that how. You know, how do you help them to become more confident in the activity that they're engaged in? And sometimes when we're as leaders, thinking about those three areas for you can be extremely helpful. So thinking about, in terms of my leadership, where am I helping people to gain clarity? How am I motivating people at the moment? And where are other people in my team who may need some help with becoming more confident about the kind of activities they're engaged in and what I'm expected of them? So very often if I'm working with teams, we'll find that if things just aren't getting done, or people aren't achieving the required performance, or the outcomes aren't being delivered, that what really is the issue very often is sitting in one of these areas. Either what they're required to do, the outcomes they're expected to deliver, and by when haven't been explained properly, so they don't have sufficient clarity, or they're not motivated to do it. And very often we're not motivated or engaged in doing things because we're not confident about doing them, or we don't understand why we're doing them. So this issue in performance coaching of being really clear with people about that expectation conversation, why are we doing it, and what's expected of you, becomes really, really important. So I want to talk a little bit now in this next segment about self-awareness and adaptability. So the reason self-awareness and adaptability are key in you as a leader when you're coaching is for several reasons really. But really, predominantly, because we want to think about our level of adaptability as leaders, because people come in all shapes, sizes and guises. So if as leaders we only have one way of leading and managing, or one way of having a conversation with people, we're not going to adapt sufficiently to the group of people around us unless we happen to be managing a group of clones. So in terms of thinking about our own self-awareness, the reason this is important in coaching is because we need to think about how self-aware am I about how my behaviour impacts the people in my team? How aware am I of how my behaviour when I'm coaching someone is impacting them? And how do I become more behaviourally flexible to go to where they're at in order to support and lead them well? So two questions I kind of want us to think about next. We're not going to do a poll on these two, but I'm going to ask you to just reflect on them for a minute. Are these two? It's helpful to think about our relationship with others when we want to be leaders who coach effectively, and our relationship with ourselves. So if we think about many conversations that we have in leadership, they're task-based, activity-based conversations. What do we need to do by when, with how much, what kind of budget, what kind of outcome, what kind of profit? We're often asking activity-type questions. So what I want you to think about for a minute is in relationship with others, when we're not just focusing on task, what could I do more of for more of the time to help my people to deliver organisations' outcomes well? So just think for a minute. What could you be doing more of for more of the time to help the people that you lead and manage to deliver outcomes even more effectively? And if it helps you, just jot a few kind of words or thoughts down. And then think about your relationship with yourself. This sounds like a strange question sometimes, and I've certainly coached a few bankers for whom this sounds like a very strange question. But thinking about, in terms of your relationship with yourself, how could I be more of the time in coaching and leading others well? So when I say how can I be, I mean how could you show up more of the time? How could you behave differently or the same more of the time? So sometimes this question isn't asking us to do things differently, it's asking us to do more of what works with the people that we lead and manage. So for example, if you're a leader who has feedback from people, has 360-degree feedback maybe, or even just feedback from speaking to people that you lead and manage, and if they're saying to you, look, I really like it when you just do your 5-minute stand-up meetings or your 10-minute stand-up meetings, don't need lots of time with you, but it would be helpful to have a bit more time with you, that's an indicator for you. That's an indicator that is useful to listen to hear. I'm getting feedback from my people about how they like me to be, how they like me to show up. So thinking about those two questions can be really helpful just in terms of asking ourselves, how can I be more successful as a leader who coaches others? And recognising that very often how we show up influences that. So I want to move on a little bit to think about this question, the first one. What can I do to help my people deliver organisational outcomes well? You may have some of these on your list, or you may have different things that you've written down, if you've written anything down. These are taken from a model I'm going to show you on the next slide, which is, again, in the book, but it's kind of a model that describes what works in terms of developing effective leadership coaching relationships with the people that you manage, and or just effective work relationships in general. So the kinds of elements that are engaged really in terms of thinking about how you coach are thinking about creating trust within your team, thinking about actually how do I actively create trusting relationships within my team. This is particularly important for any of you who manage people at a distance. It can be very difficult to try and create trust relationships across cultural boundaries, and when we're coaching and supporting people primarily on the telephone. But thinking about that, thinking how do I almost handle people who are remote from me in the same way that I might handle someone who's sitting in front of me. When somebody's sitting in front of me, we have lots of signals, lots of cues, lots of visual cues in body language, in the way that people describe things, that we tune into very, very quickly. When we're trying to create trust across a geographical boundary, we might want to think about, how do I even word, even say the phrases that I'm going to say to somebody in a coaching conversation. So in general, a general rule if you're coaching people and trying to increase trust across a telephone is to think about not just the conversation that you're having, but almost giving people a preemptive phrase that lets them know what you're about to do next. So even being able to say to them, as I'm doing with you a little bit on this call, in a minute I'm going to ask you a question. Or let's do lots of summary, let's conclude where we've got to so far. We've got another 15 minutes left. We're going to have another bit of summary in about 5 minutes. So you're not just having the coaching conversation with someone, if you're managing them at a distance, but you're also highlighting what the process is that you're following with someone. But even doing that over the course of a period of time can really help to create more trusting relationships with people that you might manage at a distance. So secondly there, I'm saying setting clear expectations in outcome delivery terms. I've alluded to this already, that actually in organisations we need to be really, really good at setting the expectation conversations. So having conversations that are very clear with people about what we expect of them and what good looks like in terms of fulfilling those expectations. So by expectations, I don't mean I'm going to tell you what you need to deliver in the next 3 months. It means here's what we have to deliver. Here's a standard to which we have to deliver it. Here's the stakeholders that we need to think about in terms of delivering the outcome. And let's think now about how you're going to deliver that expectation. And the how piece is where we do the best coaching. Okay? And it leads to this next bit, leaving room for staff to determine how they will deliver to those expectations. So coaching is very often about that, as I've said already. What we also want to try and do is to give specific feedback to individuals and teams, and notice the emphasis on specific. So this isn't about giving people very generic feedback, such as, for example, people generic feedback might sound like this. It might sound like, you did a great job with that client yesterday, well done. Now, whilst that's nice, in coaching, we want to be able to give people very specific feedback about what we've observed in their behaviour or in the way that they do something that we appreciate, so they can do more of it. So we can coach them to enhance and increase their performance in that area. So it's not giving feedback in order to tick a box, it's giving feedback in order to think about, given that you've done that well, how do we help you to do that more of the time? So a piece of specific feedback might sound more like, so yesterday I saw you working with those private clients, and in that meeting I thought you did particularly well when you explained the risks of that particular investment to them. And I really liked how you then answered the questions that they gave you in order to help them to say yes. I'd really like to see you doing that more of the time, particularly next week when we're speaking with XYZ. Okay? So very specific. So if I'm the coachee, I recognise what it is that I'm doing that you think is getting results. What am I doing? And let's talk together about what I'm doing that's helping us to get results in the team and in the organisation. If we also get really good at giving specific feedback, what you'll begin to notice is you also get very good at then being able to give feedback when it's less than positive. Okay? So sometimes people in organisations, you will have heard it yourselves, I'm sure some of you will say, I know I'm doing a good job when nobody tells me that I'm not. Okay? It's not a very motivating place to be if you're on the receiving end of that kind of feedback. So we want to get really good at giving feedback as managers, particularly in the coaching context, so that when we have to give difficult feedback, it's easier to do that. You also want, in the fourth point there, to be able to actively monitor progress regularly and note milestones. So this is much more about, in the coaching context, thinking about we've got one big outcome to deliver, but how do we help people to spot what are the milestones in delivering to that outcome and that expectation? How will we know when you've achieved each of those milestones? And therefore, as your leader, your manager, how can I progress monitor what you're doing? So what will be the signal for me that you're on track? So that's why monitoring progress is really important. And also this one, discussing the application of recent learning and development needs. I've just mentioned that a little bit earlier. But it can be helpful to think about, how often as a leader in conversation with the people that I manage, do I actually talk about recent learning and talk about what the emerging needs might be of the people that I'm managing? You also want to think about how do I proactively manage conflict, because particularly in terms of engagement and particularly in terms of motivation too, if we don't actively manage conflict as leaders and we just let things run along unsaid or the unspoken kind of elephants in the room, that then turns into something else for the individuals in the team. It can turn to mistrust. It can turn to issues around people not cooperating with each other. So thinking clearly in terms of how do I manage the conflict quickly in my team, because that will help us to deliver organisational outcomes well. Okay. So on that second question that we just had, what are the ingredients of self-awareness that I need in order to lead well? So this model on the right-hand side is the model that I mentioned to you. It's in the Business Coaching and Mentoring for Dummies book. It's obviously here on the slide for you to use too. And this is a model that we talk about in the book as one for leaders to help them to think, and business owners to think about self-awareness and relationship mastery and how that impacts on results and trust in teams. So again, just thinking about, if I think about myself and the level of self-awareness that I need to bring to a coaching conversation, or to just leading my people more generally, these are some of the elements that I think are really important. So they're similar to the previous list. So to trust yourself, to get it right and manage well most of the time. No one is perfect. We're never all going to manage and get it right all of the time. But trust yourself to get it right most of the time. Learning how to really get very good at explaining why. For any of you who haven't come across the work of Simon Sinek, S-I-N-E-K, he has a great 2 or 3 YouTube videos on the importance of explaining why in organisations that I recommend to you. But thinking very clearly about why you expect something to be delivered and why it's important. So as individuals in organisations, we need to be able to make sense of what we're being asked to do, and explaining why enables us to do that. Thirdly, developing a growth mindset. Very simply, growth mindset is about having an approach which says that you take a view that people can be developed, that people can grow under your leadership, and that you're open to the possibility of people growing and being able to develop. Again, the person's work I'd recommend on that is Carol Dweck at Stanford University, who's written a great book on mindset. Also think about how do I stretch myself out of the comfort zone, out of my own comfort zone. How do I enable myself to be a continuous learner, particularly for those of you who are managing people going through accounting exams or banking exams. Really helpful for them to see you as a continuous learner, as I know you do have to be for your CPD. But just thinking about, how do I show my people that I'm learning? Developing behavioural flexibility, I've said quite a bit of that, so I won't say any more on that one, but thinking about how do I do that to get things delivered through other people. And also using the feedback that you've received from individuals. So being able to think about what application does feedback have that you're getting and how do I use it. Okay, so I'm going to give you 3 of these during the next 20 minutes or so. I want you to think about 3 different actions, but the first one I want you to think about just for yourself. I'm not going to share anything. You can, of course, if you want to. Type a message at the bottom of your screen if you wish. But I want you to think about one action that you could take to coach with and support the performance of at least one member of your team even more. So one small action. Okay. We're going to move on to look at how do we create a purposeful coaching environment. So what are the ingredients that need to be present if we're coaching well within the environment? I'm going to share a model with you. Again, it's on the slide fully, which is in the book. And if we're having coaching conversations that are purposeful, this is the kind of model that I tend to use myself. I use it with coaches if I'm coaching coaches, and I use it in my own practice too in different ways. So I want you to just think about the three things in purple boxes: preparation and contracting, creating thinking awareness, and closing. So every purposeful coaching conversation involves preparing and contracting. So thinking about at the beginning of the conversation, this is where the collaborative piece comes in. So what are we here for? What would you like to get from the meeting? What are the desired outcomes of this meeting? How we're going to work together during this meeting? and helping to be adaptive in that moment. So not necessarily always going in with just the agreed agenda, but having a minute of dialogue at the beginning to contract with the individual about what's going to happen during the meeting and any other issues that they want to bring. The second bit is really about creating thinking awareness, which is what we're doing in a coaching conversation. If you think back to those three things we mentioned earlier around clarity and such like, well, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to, in that conversation, help the person with their thinking to get their thinking straight so they can go away and take action. So in that thinking awareness, we want to do some very clear things. We want to listen very actively. We want to be very clear about moving towards action, be action and outcome orientated and expectation focused. And we also want to make sure that when the individual, the coachee, comes up with actions themselves, that we make sure that they stay with them. So very often, when we get to the closing piece of a conversation, in reality, as managers, we're very often thinking about the next meeting and on to the next meeting. And we close many of our meetings not so well. So I want to really encourage you to think about when you're coaching your people, how effective are you being at doing that closing? Because it's the closing that helps individuals to remember who's taking what action. So we want to do some things when we get to the closing. We want to make sure that we're on track to deliver to outcome. We want to make sure that any actions that have been articulated by the coachee are actually staying with the coachee. And one effective way of doing that, which is so simple, but we don't always do it, is to get them, the person you're coaching, to articulate the actions, to actually say them out loud, or to send you an email with them. Rather than what we very often do as leaders, which is we do the summary at the end, and it then looks as though we're taking the actions away from the individual. The other reason we want the individual to come up with their own actions in summary is because it helps you to see as the leader if they've missed anything out. If they're just not hearing something, they're deleting something. But in the closing, we also want to do some acknowledgement. Some acknowledgement, this is where we might give some feedback again, feedback of what we're already noticing they're doing well, and to check that issue around, so how will we know, what are the milestones that we will see in your progress towards delivering the outcome between now and maybe next time. So it's almost a kind of closing off of the conversation, but with a future focus. So in a coaching conversation, we want to do some very clear things. And these are they. We want to be clear about the purpose of the conversation, what time we have and what we will discuss. That's the contracting piece. To be fully present in the conversation without distraction. I know this is difficult for many of us, where we lead busy, busy lives and busy, busy work lives. But even simple things like turning off the phone, making sure it's not on vibrate for the next half an hour or an hour, however long you're with someone, turning off any alerts on your screen, moving away from computers. Simple things that just enable you to be more present with the individual. It's almost as though we're saying to someone, this time is important and the time is yours for the next half an hour or an hour that we're together, however long it is. Thirdly, to listen actively. So when we're listening actively, we're not doing what we do in most meetings. We're not just listening in order to respond or to come in when it's my turn or something that I have to say, I have a thing to say. We're listening fully and actively to what the person is saying to us. Even doing that, even practicing how to listen actively, can be a huge motivator for the people that we manage. Very often if we're working in organisations, people will say they just don't feel listened to. Coaching conversations are a great way of enabling people to be really heard and listened to, even for short bursts of time. Again, we want to make sure that the conversation is collaborative, it's exploratory. So in that second part of the model that I showed you, we want to make sure that we're exploring issues rather than what I said at the beginning. It's not a ping-pong conversation. It's not an ask and tell conversation. We also want to come to the conversation expecting the person to have ideas and to articulate their own actions. So sometimes if we just start changing the nature of how we lead and manage people and we want to move more towards a coaching style, this bit can be quite difficult. Sometimes we have to sit in silences with people to create that expectation that they will have ideas and that the ideas will be articulated in the meeting. But we do have to ask. We do have to ask people sometimes, I'm interested in your ideas. Let's toss this around for half an hour and come up with some ideas about how you might handle X. Okay? Sometimes when I train people to train leaders in particular to coach, they'll say, yes, but it looks like I'm faking it because I have the answer, so why don't I just give them it? Well, you have one answer, or you have the answer about the way that you've been doing it, whatever the activity is. But in truth, if we generate ideas from other people who are going to have to implement those ideas, they're going to have to implement that how of delivering to an outcome, they're going to be more motivated to do it and they're going to have more success, providing, of course, you've assessed all the risks involved and that kind of thing. But it helps you also to think about where that person's coming from and where their ideas are, where their head is at, if you like, in terms of how they might deliver an outcome. Okay? And sometimes that might be as simple as saying to people, yes, I do have an answer to the question that I'm asking you, but I'm really interested in hearing your take on this. I'm really interested in hearing how you would approach this from your own experience, or what you think the best ways of doing this. Okay? In a coaching conversation, we want to let the coachee do the majority of talking. I would say that it's mostly a kind of 80% the coachee, 20% you. 70% maybe the coachee and 30% you, until you get really good at coaching. But that's the kind of percentages we're looking at. And encourage the coachee to summarise their own actions back to you. I've already mentioned the importance of doing that because it encourages and increases ownership of action. Okay, so I'd like you to, again, take your piece of paper or whatever, your keyboard, whatever you're writing, scribbling on, and just think about this question and write down a key phrase or a word or two to remind you one action that I will take to be more purposeful in conversations and meetings with the people I lead and manage. So what is the one thing? We're not looking for grand statements, just the one thing that you could do to be more purposeful, to have more purposeful conversations. Okay, we've got some questions coming in, which is great. I'm going to save them all to the end, but keep them coming. So we've got about 10 questions at the minute. So let's move to the last segment, thinking about how do we use coaching to engage people, empower them and get results. We've already covered some of this in terms of just thinking about your actions that you've just articulated and the ones before. But what do I mean by that? What I mean here is there are lots of situations where we might use the coaching skill set, and here are some of them. So I've given you a list of those here. And sometimes when we're trying to engage people in the organisation, we don't automatically think of using the coaching skill set to do that. And I want you to just think about where are the situations where you might use the coaching skill set more often, enabling you to have very constructive and purposeful conversations. So if we think about the fact that at its very least, coaching is about having a purposeful conversation that has an outcome, and its very least it involves us as leaders listening more actively, enabling the other person to take action, enabling them to articulate their ideas, to get clarity around their ideas, to think about actually how do I enable this person to become more confident about doing what I need them to do, and just enabling people to think through their own position in relation to where they sit in the organisation and where they fit in the organisation. Okay? So here are some areas where we could use coaching. I'm going to ask Julie just to put up the next poll question. And in the next poll question, sorry, I've gone ahead too far. I want you to just look at the 6 areas that you have in front of you. So we have 6 areas. I want you to think about picking one area where you think your organisation or you could use coaching skills more often. So where would it be? If you were just to pick one area where you could use the skill set more often, to coach more often, where would that be? Which of these areas that you have in front of you, A to E? So keep voting. You've got a few seconds left. So keep voting. Got a few seconds left. Okay, so let's look at those percentages. Great. So most of you, 39% of you, thought that if you were going to pick one area, it would be consultation during change and transition. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. 28% of you one-to-one meetings, 17% of you motivating staff by highlighting what's going well, 11% planning projects, pieces of work, and 6% in career discussions. Really interesting. Okay. So in terms of that issue of consultation during change and transition, coaching has a huge part to play in dealing with that and in helping to support people in transition. One of the attachments that you will have to this presentation is an article that I wrote on empowering teams to successfully navigate change. If you look at that article and think about that in the coaching context, that will really help you when you're thinking about handling change and how you might support people using coaching. And the other handout that I've given you is actually about purposeful coaching. I'm going to talk about that in a second, but about thinking through how do I help people to think purposefully and what kind of tools might I use to enable people to do that. So in that handout I've given you a really simple coaching model, which is a solution-focused coaching model, which you can practice and use and develop if you indeed don't use one of those already. So that kind of model that I've given you, you can use it actually in any of these situations that you're describing here, particularly in one-to-one meetings, consultation in change, motivating people, and planning projects and pieces of work. A little bit more difficult to do in career discussions if they're generic career discussions, but if they're things like can I have your support to think through whether to apply for a promotion or not within the organisation and what I think I have to offer, the method that I've given you is perfect for that. So I'm going to move on to give you a bit of input in terms of thinking about how we might support people to get results. And these are three types of conversation that I will often suggest that people consider when they're coaching their staff or planning to coach their staff. They're drawn from an author called Bill Treasurer, who talks about courage and courageous leadership. And my premise here is that really there are three types of conversation that we have in organisations that we need to consider having in coaching. There's the try conversation, where we're helping people to step up and take action. When we want to try and motivate people to have a go at doing something, to try something out, to look at the risks of something and take calculated risks, acceptable risks, but taking action. Trust-building conversations. This is where we might be letting go of the reins to an employee, allowing them to step up and shine, resisting the temptation sometimes to control how they're doing what they're doing. But also trust-building happens when we give lots of feedback. Basically when people know where they stand in the organisation and in relation to you as their leader. Then tell conversations. Sometimes we want to have tell conversations in coaching and one-to-ones, in those conversations where we're looking at change management, because we want to be able to address difficult issues. Sometimes we want to be able to tell people things that they're not doing so well. Sometimes we want to be able to tell people the things that actually are going to be unpopular, maybe during times of change. Okay. We also want to be clear about the tell conversations when we might have something to tell someone, where we might want to say, look, I'm basically self-aware enough to know that the behaviour that I've been deploying towards you isn't working, so I'm going to try something different. Now that requires a lot of courage on behalf of leaders, but it can be exceptionally powerful to think about where do I as a leader need to do more of the tell when it's about me and my behaviour in relation to the people that I manage. So it can be helpful to think about where's the balance of your conversations when you're planning conversations with individuals that you manage or the team that you manage. What kind of conversation are you about to engage in? Is it a try-based conversation, a trust-building conversation, or a tell conversation? Or what is the balance of those three elements in the conversation that you're about to have? Okay. So I'd like you to do one action. I'd like you to think about one action that you will take in relation to a conversation that you need to have to either improve or sustain performance in the team that you lead and manage. So where are those areas where you maybe need to do more try, more trust, or more tell? And just think of one thing that you could do in that arena that may help to improve or sustain performance. So sometimes in change management, it's being very clear with people about future direction and what that means, and being very clear with people about the level of performance you still expect to get during a process or a program of change. Sometimes we avoid that in organisations, and it doesn't always help people because people like to know what's expected of them, particularly during change. Okay, so in conclusion then from me, here's my premise of what I've been talking about for the last 50 minutes or so. To be an effective leader, you need to coach and do it well. So my premise is that it's becoming an expectation. It's not a nice-to-have feature of management. It used to be a nice-to-have feature. But in terms of particularly Generation Y and Generation Z employees coming through the system, you're probably noticing, if you're a more mature manager, that there's an expectation about being coached. People expect lots of feedback. They want lots of feedback to feel like they're doing a good job. Okay. Coaching is a focused and collaborative process. It's a conversation requiring your full attention, absolute active leadership, and absolute purposeful presence. Becoming even more self-aware as a leader enhances your coaching capability. And so I guess what I would say in conclusion is it isn't all about them. It's actually about you and how you show up, not just about how they show up. Okay, that's how you can get hold of me. I'm going to have a look at the questions now and take some of the questions. Julie, do you want to pop in or anything or not?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marie, for your very informative presentation. You've certainly given us some great points to take away and think about today. Just quickly before we pose some questions to Marie, should anyone require a copy of the slides from Marie's presentation, you can download these from the Attachments tab along with some further materials you may find useful. So Marie, we've had a question come in from an internal coach within a company, and they've asked, would it be better to have an external coach for their team to keep neutrality within the organisation?
Okay, this is a really good question. So I think internal coaches in organisations have a huge part to play, and we should be very grateful for them because they help to change the culture of organisations, but also really help basically help leaders to get things done and to be able to support individuals in teams. I think it depends on what the issue is. I'm going to say it depends. So if it's a team that you're part of, I definitely wouldn't be an internal coach within that team. That wouldn't be appropriate. You can't be impartial and objective. If it's an issue around a senior person, so my general advice on this is if the coach is as senior or more senior than the individual, it can be much easier to coach them. It can be much easier for the individual to accept coaching from somebody at their level or above. If it's an issue that requires some different thinking and you're seen as the internal coach as being part of the company or part of the problem, this is where being self-aware as an internal coach is really important. It's useful to just think, no, this is for an external. But I think if the issue is quite simple, and if the issue is about not it doesn't have to be a simple issue, I'm sorry, it can be a very complex issue. But if it's something that you are capable of coaching around and you're confident about doing it, and it isn't necessarily, you're not going into it feeling as though it's a loaded conversation because you are involved in it, or seem to be involved in it, then it's great. I think sometimes the coach knows, so the fact that whoever's asking the question, if you've got any question about it in your mind at all, it's worth exploring. And if you've got any doubt in your mind, my suggestion would be to look at external coaching.
Brilliant, thank you. Another question we've had come in today is, could you explain what might be different if we were to coach over the phone? Yes,
it's hugely different. It's far more challenging coaching over the phone. Obviously, if you can ever use visual methods like Skype or webinar type software, always easier if you can physically see the person. Some of the real challenges are around, we've got a little bit here at the beginning, people saying I keep losing the sound, it's just cutting out, the sound's echoing. are about being really clear about preparations. That model that I showed you of thinking initially about how do I prepare for this conversation. Things like making sure you have no distractions, making sure nothing's going to be buzzing in the background, because it all puts the coachee off who's on the other end of the phone. Also thinking, as one thing that I do, which sounds a bit strange, but it works for me, is before I coach somebody on the phone, if I have it, I get a photograph of them. And I look at that photograph and remember who I'm talking to. Because we have so many visual clues in our face-to-face interactions, we want to try and replicate those as much as we can when we're coaching people at a distance. The other thing that can be really helpful, and it sounds too simple, is having a headset, and a headset that works really well, so that when you're coaching people at a distance, you have your hands free in case you want to send them something. So you're not having to interrupt the conversation too much. So you want to try and minimize interruptions to the conversation. And you also want to think about how do I enable this conversation to be purposeful by walking the person through the conversation. So for example, giving clues like, in a moment, I'm going to ask you some questions about how you handled the deal in relation to Marie Taylor, for example. And we're going to go through that deal and work out what you did well and where the areas of learning might be. And we call that signalling in coaching. So we're just signalling, in a few minutes, I'm going to be asking you about that. So, because it's easier to do that for people on the phone. They need different types of auditory signals, not just visual signals.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marie. I think we're just running out of time for any more questions, but if our listeners would like to get in touch with Marie, you can do so through her contact details that you'll see on screen. I'd just like to ask one final favour of our audience today, to please remember to give us a rating and feedback from today's session so that we can keep delivering what you would like to hear. And also, should anybody like to listen back or recommend this webcast to colleagues, it will be available from the original link that was in the invitation. Thanks again, Marie. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and advice today. Also, thanks to everyone at home for joining us. Have a great day, everybody.
My
Goodbye.
pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Marie. Bye-bye.
Bye.